Thank you all for joining us. I'm Matthew Silverman, Director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our program titled Redemptive Hope and Fulfillment, Inspiration for Your Passover Seder with Dr. David Arnow. This is our second annual Avi West Memorial Lecture. Thank you again to Carol and Gary Berman and Ann Feinberg for sponsoring our inaugural program last year, which explored the holiday of Shavuot. Today's lecture continues Avi West's legacy of bringing meaningful holiday programs to our community. Avi was a powerhouse in the Jewish education world who brought creativity, knowledge, and innovation to all of his teaching. This year, we will explore aspects of Passover, which for those of you who haven't looked at your calendar recently, it is just over a week away. In other words, it's time to start preparing. We hope this program will be an opportunity for you all to begin to reflect upon the meaning of the holiday this year and gain new insights to share at your Passover Seder. Thank you to Andrew Ammerman for sponsoring this lecture in memory of Josephine and H. Max Ammerman and Stephen C. Ammerman. And also thank you to Carl Cohen and Wendy Rubenstein for sponsoring in memory of Carl's father, Arthur Cohen. I would also like to thank Bethel Hebrew Congregation and Agudas Achim Congregation, both in Alexandria, Virginia, for helping bring our lecture to the community. My usual logistical note, if you have any questions during the presentation, please click on the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. There might be a couple of opportunities this session to ask questions, so go ahead and type them in whenever you have them in mind. And so now I welcome Bill Halpern, a member of our Haberman Institute board, who will introduce our speaker. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Matt. Welcome, friends, to the Haberman Institute and this evening's lecture, Redemptive Hope and Fulfillment, Inspiration for Your Passover Seder with David Arnow. I'm honored to be introducing tonight's lecture, our second annual talk in memory of our friend and teacher, Avi West. As many of you know, Avi was one of the most inspirational and highly respected Jewish educators in our community. And we were privileged that he served as a member of the Haberman Board of Directors for more than 5 years. Avi was a mentor to many leaders in the field of Jewish studies, and he set an example for us to emulate, not only in education, but in life. Avi passed away in August 2021. We miss him dearly. I'm Bill Halpern. I am the treasurer of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies. For those joining us who are new to our lectures and classes, we are glad you are here learning with us this evening. Our organization's mission is to provide adults with high-quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture. You're in the right place. We invite you to learn more about our programs and classes by visiting our website, habermaninstitute.org. We have many more lectures and opportunities to learn together coming up right after Passover. And now for this evening's talk. David Arnow, a clinical psychologist, received a doctorate from Boston University. He is a scholar of the Festival of Passover and the author of many articles and 2 books on that subject, including Creating Lively Passover Seders, a source book of engaging tales, texts, and activities, and My People's Passover Haggadah, traditional texts, modern commentaries, co-edited with Lawrence A. Hoffman. He is an author of the website Exodus Conversations, How the Story of the Exodus Speaks to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and Leadership in the Bible, a practical guide for today, co-authored with Paul Ohana. His latest book, Choosing Hope, The Heritage of Judaism, was published by the Jewish Publication Society in 2022. With that impressive resume, I turn the Zoom platform over to you, Dr. Arnow. I know we are all looking forward to learning with you tonight. Thank you for sharing your expertise, insight, and Passover inspiration with all of us.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bill. And first of all, let me say it's an honor to be delivering a lecture, a memorial lecture that is connected with Avi West, somebody that I can see from your great affection and esteem for him has had enormous influence on your community. So it's an honor to be in any way connected with him. And I want to thank Matt Silverman and Rebecca Levy for really helping to make this program possible and for organizing all kinds of different parts of it. So many, many thanks. I think that we can begin. Oh, there we go. Okay. I wanted to, okay, a slight little adjustment to the screen there. Okay. So the title of this talk, a little bit is missing from the top, which is important. Who fulfills our hopes for redemption? The Passover Haggadah, Moses, and the human role in the Exodus from Egypt. So I want to give you a little, I'm hearing a little feedback. I don't know what to make of that. But if there's an issue, maybe somebody could get in touch with me in the chat or something like that. Let me just, I want to, oh, anyway, I want to give you a little roadmap of where we're going to be going tonight. I want to begin with a couple of factors and kind of background factors that help shape the evolution of the Passover Haggadah, and specifically that influence the way in which Moses is or isn't depicted in the Passover Haggadah, and in the way in which human beings participate or don't in the Haggadah's telling of the story of the Exodus. After we'll look at some texts from the Haggadah itself, how some other texts have influenced and shaped the Haggadah's understanding of issues like human participation in the Exodus, and particularly, again, the role of Moses. And then we'll find Moses, because Moses, many people think, is not there at all. He's there in a minimized form, but in very important ways nonetheless. And then we'll spend some time, and this is really the second part of the program, along with looking at Moses in the Haggadah, looking at what the Haggadah has to say about the way in which human beings actually do participate in the redemption from Egypt, but I would say more broadly in the whole redemptive process writ large. And the question is, why is this important? This is not a program that's just about correcting a myth that Moses is absent from the Passover Haggadah and showing you that it's fact there. The underlying reason why that's important is that we need to be able to look at our traditional texts, and we need to be able to find in them inspiration for meeting the challenges, and they're very big ones, that face us now as Jews in the world, as human beings in the world, as a human species on this earth. We need to be able to look at some of our really most beloved texts and find a message of empowerment for human beings to take up the challenges that are facing us, and not to wait in a passive way for some greater power to solve those problems for us. Because if you were to look at Jewish liturgy, and the Passover Haggadah is a really fine specimen of Jewish liturgy, if you were to look at that, you might get the impression that the best thing for us to do is to wait for God, to wait for Hashem to come and solve the problems. That's a message that might have been very suitable, as we'll see, for different reasons for our people at certain times in history. I don't think it's the reason, the message rather, that we want to be deriving from our texts today. So that's where we're going to be going in this journey tonight, and why it's important. Now, a couple of factors to think about as we consider a couple of key passages in the Passover Haggadah. Number one, what is the sort of the fundamental event that shapes the development of the Passover Haggadah? It is the destruction of the temple in the year 70. Because prior to that, we certainly don't have any Passover Haggadah. We don't have, as far as we know, we have no Passover ritual that resembles anything like a Passover Seder. What we have is a Passover sacrifice taking place in the temple, probably the recitation of some psalms, and eating the Passover sacrifice with a group of people. And we do have a text from maybe 100 or so BCE that speaks about wine, but we don't have anything that in conjunction with the Passover sacrifice. But we don't, other than those things, we have nothing that resembles a Passover Seder at all. And so the Passover Seder, as we know it, is taking the place of something that is lost, namely this whole sacrificial ritual which revolved so much around the temple. Now we have to understand another thing. Why is it that the temple was destroyed? And so here, the answer to that is pretty straightforward. It was destroyed because there was a rebellion against Rome in the years 66 to 70, and that led to the destruction of the temple. There was another rebellion in 132 to 135 CE, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and that led to really the plowing under of Jerusalem as a city, the banning of Jews from entering what was left of it, and the deportation really of vast numbers of Jews from the land of Israel, with pockets being left here and there. So we have a picture of these two disastrously failed rebellions preceding the development of the Passover Seder. And what we have is a sense that, and we find this repeated in many different places in rabbinic literature, that when it comes to the redemptive timetable, we're now going to leave this in the hands of God. We're not going to push the redemptive timetable by taking too much human action. And so what you'll see in the Passover Haggadah is human beings not doing very much, not encouraged to do very much, but God pretty much doing almost everything. And it's a very different depiction than what you see in the book of Exodus. Book of Exodus is very comfortable showing us the roles of the midwives, the roles of Miriam, Yocheved, the daughter of Pharaoh, and the roles of Aaron and Moses and others as well. We don't see that in the Passover Haggadah much at all. And the reason, I think, is to put a damper on the idea that we're looking for a human being or human action that, God forbid, would lead us to another disastrous outcome, such as that came after those two failed rebellions. So is a major set of factors that's shaping the development of the Passover Haggadah, the earliest developments of which we see in about the year 200. And then it continues to develop over a very long time, up until today even. In addition to these historical factors, there are theological factors that we need to consider as well. We now, looking back on our history, we understand Judaism to be a completely monotheistic religion in which there are no intermediary figures, in which there is only one God up in heaven. But as we'll see, that was not always the case in Judaism, and it certainly wasn't the case in the religions that were surrounding Judaism at the time that the Haggadah was developing. We have two things, really. We have within Judaism the evolution of what is going to become the monotheism that we know, and it's going to develop in contrast to other views in Judaism that are talking about maybe there are intermediary figures, maybe there is more than one God, maybe there's an old one and a young one. Judaism is eventually going to repudiate those. And then there are these other religions that are developing as well, principally Christianity, which is also having a very different notion of what's up in heaven. And we'll see a little bit of that later too. So historical factors, theological factors, and I'll add one other, which I think really sort of characterizes a lot of the Passover Haggadah. The notion that you'll see in the Haggadah, God kind of just doing everything. The power of God is what is emphasized. And I want to say that the reason for that emphasis is I think that there was really a question about whether the God of the Exodus, the God whose strong hand and outstretched arm was so active in bringing about the Exodus, whether that God is in some way still around, still available, still as strong as in former times. And I want to share with you a midrash now. This is not in the handout material. It's a very poignant midrash that raises this question. And it's from a source that we're going to see a lot tonight, the Mechilta of Rabbi Ishmael, which is a collection of midrashim on the book of Exodus that was collected around the year 200. So it and a few other midrashic collections are from about that period, are our earliest midrashic sources. And this one in particular is a source that the Haggadah borrows a lot from, both in terms of ideas and in terms of actual texts. We'll see more of those texts as we go on tonight. But here is a parable that comes from the Mechilta. It says, there may be a hero in a country, but the strength which he has at the age of 40 is not like that which he has at the age of 60, nor is the strength that he has at the age of 60 what he has at the age of 70. But as he goes on, his strength becomes diminished. The one by whose word the world came into being, however, is not so. And now quoting a verse from the prophet Malachi, I, Adonai, change not. So what you see behind this is really a question of whether or not God is like a king of flesh and blood, at a young age, nice and strong, getting older and older, weaker and weaker. And we're going to see that the tendency to deny is really belies a whole set of concerns. Okay, so that's kind of background. That's where we're going. These are the background factors. So what I'd like to do now is I would like to look at text 1. And I'm hoping that Rebecca can scroll forward. There we go. Text 1. Very good. Okay, so I'm sure that, well, people have gotten this handout before tonight. So you may have looked at the handout and you may have already seen, and you may have already heard me say tonight that yes, Moses is indeed in the Passover Haggadah. But if you did not have this special information, you might, like many people, have the notion that Moses is not mentioned in the Passover Haggadah at all. And I'll give you I'll read for you text 1, which used to be on a very popular Jewish website that is full of very good quality Jewish content. And I call this the common view. The Passover Haggadah has a glaring omission. Where is Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher? Moshe is not even mentioned once. How can we have a recounting of the Exodus and ignore the central character? What point is the Haggadah trying to make? The Seder reminds us that not only was God ultimately responsible for the redemption, God was entirely responsible. As the Haggadah says, God took us out not by the hands of an angel, not by the hands of a messenger, but the Holy One in God's full glory. So the postscript on this common view on the source is that I was actually at a certain point in touch with the website and the author and had a conversation with him about some of the things that we'll be talking about tonight. And this website is no longer up in this way. And there is a different understanding and depiction of Moses on this very website now, which is kind of nice. Okay, so now we're going to actually, Rebecca, can you get text 2 up there now? Okay, good. So before we get to this is a central text in the Passover Haggadah that we're going to be referring back to many times, and we'll read it out loud in a minute. But before it has a special quality and a special kind of rhythm to it, which I want you to hear. But I think in order to really get the tone of this, you need to hear what comes before it, because it's very, very different. So let me read to you a little bit of what comes before this passage that we're going to get to, the not by an angel passage, okay? And all of this, by the way, is in what's called the Wandering Aramaean Midrash, a section of the Maggid, where the Passover story is told in this kind of midrashic way. And what I'm going to begin with is the typical style of that Maggid, that midrash. So listen to this. We cried to the Lord God of our fathers, as it is written, in the course of those many days, the king of Egypt died. The people of Israel moaned because of their servitude and cried for help. Their cry out of bondage reached God. The Lord heard our cry, as it is written. God heard their cry, their moaning. God remembered the covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. and saw our affliction, that is, the enforced separation of husband and wife. As it is written, God saw the people of Israel and knew their plight. We'll be talking about that specifically more a little bit later. Our trouble refers to the drowning of the children, as it is written, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Our oppression means the persecution, as it is written, I have seen how the Egyptians are persecuting them. So that's the typical style of what precedes this particular passage that we're going to read now and what follows it. And so we have a little variety in the voices that you're going to be hearing tonight. Matt, could you read that passage number 2, the Lord brought us out from Egypt?
Sure.
Thanks.
The Lord brought us out from Egypt with a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and an awesome power, and by signs and portents. Are you all getting feedback on that?
We're getting a lot of feedback. Maybe, should I read? Maybe I should do that.
Maybe. Yeah, I'll try and figure out.
No, it's bad. A lot of feedback. Okay, so I'll do the reading. And if you get that fixed, try to let me know in some way. So let me start again. The Lord brought us out from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm, and awesome power, and by signs and portents. The Lord brought us out. That's a verse from Deuteronomy. Okay. Now it's going to break this down into different parts. The Lord brought us out from Egypt, not by an angel, not by a seraph, not by a messenger, but by the Holy One, blessed be he himself, as it is written. I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night. I will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from man unto beast. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night. I and not an angel. I will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. I and not a seraph. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I and not the messenger. I am the Lord. I am he, and no other. So I think you can get the very different sense and feeling and rhythm of this midrash and compared to what precedes it. What precedes it is very narrative. It's not particularly polemical. This is very polemical, and you get this rhythm. It's really, you'll feel like a point is being made and you're being sort of knocked on the head. That God is the one. It is not this one. It's not the angel. It's not the malach. It's not the seraph. It's God and only God. And you get this refrain, Ani hu, I am he. And we'll see that Ani hu, which comes up in some of the other rabbinic literature that we'll be looking at. Now, what I want to say here is that there's something to learn from Sigmund Freud here. Freud, in 1925, he wrote an essay called Negation. And in that essay, he said that in a judgment, whenever a negative opinion is expressed, a negation is expressed, it's as if the individual is saying, at bottom, I would prefer for that idea to be repressed, to stay repressed. And so what we're seeing is that there's a tremendous amount of denial. There's a tremendous amount of negation. And what we can suspect just from Freud's insight here is that this is showing us, in some sense, what it is that's actually being repressed. It's showing through, except it comes with a negative sign in front of it. It's not an angel. It's not a seraph. It's not a messenger. So if we scroll down a little bit, if we go down to text 3:2, yeah, that's perfect. We're going to see that there are things in the Bible, actually in the Bible itself, that this text could be speaking against. And so text 3:1 from the book of Numbers. We cried to the Lord, and he heard our plea, and he sent a malach. A malach can be an angel or a messenger who took us out of Egypt. So what we just heard in the Haggadah is no angels, no messengers. And here we see in the book of Numbers, maybe so. The word malach is right there. Another text, and this is a particularly kind of strange one from the book of Exodus itself. And because there's another figure that is right in the story. And unless, if you could easily pass this over, but it's worth, after tonight, I don't think you will. So when the Lord goes through to smite the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the lintel and the two doorposts, and the Lord will pass over the door and not let the destroyer, the mashchit, enter and smite your home. So here, it is not that God is slaying the firstborn. God is actually stopping this other being, this mashchit, who's doing the slaying, from attacking the homes of Jews. It's like God is a policeman and saying, you know, not this house, not this house, that house over there. It's actually the blood that is directing the mashchit to strike or not strike. But all of a sudden, in the Bible itself, there's this other being that's responsible, it seems, for the slaying of the firstborn. So right in the Bible, there's plenty for the Haggadah to be reacting to if it wants to tell a story where God is the only character on the stage. Because in the Bible, not so, even with regard to taking the Israelites out of Egypt and that last plague. So let's continue on with our text, please. That's great. Perfect. And what we see is that this issue of other figures, of angels or other beings acting in conjunction with the Exodus, does not stop with the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers. There's a whole literature that develops in the Second Temple period, in which there are other intermediaries, there are other beings that are acting, and the Haggadah is reacting to these things too. And I'll give you a sample of something here. This is from the book of Jubilees, which is a book that was written in Hebrew. It is about, it's sort of like a midrashic recounting of the book of Exodus and the book of Genesis. It conceivably could have been included in the canon, but for various reasons, it was not. And you see it's put together about 135 to 105 BCE. And here's what it has to say about this last plague. For on this night, the beginning of the festival and the beginning of the joy, you were eating the Passover in Egypt, when all the powers of Mastema had been let loose to slay all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the captive maidservant in the mill, and to the cattle. So here we have Mastema, some other character. Mastema is in the book of Jubilees, this kind of punishing angel. The word appears in Hosea, and it means hatred or enmity. But here it's this other being that's kind of taking a very active role and actually doing the slaying. Then we come to a Christian text, the Gospel of John. Here, let me read this one, because we're going to see something that's very, very different, very important, and fuels a lot of thought in the whole evolution of Judaism's concept of monotheism. In the beginning was the Word, and that word in Greek is logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and the only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So here we have this logos. Logos, in this case, is it Jesus? Is it a part of Jesus? Is it the Word that is so closely associated with Jesus? Not exactly clear, although it literally means word, but in Christian thought and in Jewish thought too, it's much more than just a word, because it can be a sort of a disembodied active force as well. And we find earlier Jewish texts that use this word logos. Philo, for example, spoke of the logos as a second deity. And we find in early manuscripts of the Passover Haggadah that in this passage that says, not by an angel, not by a messenger, and not by a seraph, there's something else that's added in certain old manuscripts, which is lo al yedei hadiber. Hadiber is one of the Hebrew terms for logos, kind of like the word. Lo al yedei hadiber. So pretty clear that there's a logos theology out there in Judaism and outside Judaism, and the Haggadah is taking aim at various manuscripts at that as well. If we could go down a little further, that would be great, please, with our texts. Okay. That's great. Okay. So now we're going to look again at this Mechilta of Rabbi Ishmael, this 3rd century midrash on the book of Exodus. And I said it's important. It's important because the Haggadah borrows things directly from it. The 4 children, there's a slightly different version of the 4 children in the Mechilta of Rabbi Ishmael. The pour out your wrath verses, there's a midrash on that. It's very much related to the pour out your wrath verses that we find in the Passover Haggadah. And a number of other texts as well come directly from the Mechilta. And here we're going to see also that this is an early source for this language that's speaking against the notion of an angel or a messenger taking any role in the slaying of the firstborn. So I will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, quoting from this passage, part of Exodus 12:12. I might understand this to mean through an angel or through an agent, through a malach or a shaliach. But it says, the Lord smote all the firstborn, quoting another verse in Exodus. And the Midrash is saying, not through an angel, not through an agent. And scholars of this Mechilta of Rabbi Ishmael believe that when you see this, I might understand this to mean, that's kind of a veiled reference to like a heretical voice saying, raising a certain point. It's as if to say, we believe over here in our group that this slaying of the firstborn was done by an angel or by a shaliach. But there's like a putting down of that to say, no, lo al yedei malach, lo al yedei shaliach. Okay. I want to go down to the next text, please, also from the Mechilta of Rabbi Ishmael. Okay, good. So I said that there were questions, that's perfect. I said that there were ideas in Judaism about monotheism. And what it evolved. This what we have now, we didn't start off with in the same way by any means. And you're going to see a reference to something very specific. I'll tell you a little bit more about that when we're through this text. So, I am the Lord your God. Why is it said? For this reason. At the sea, he appeared to them as a mighty hero doing battle. As it is said, the Lord is a man of war. At Sinai, he appeared to them as an old man full of mercy. It is said, and they saw the God of Israel. Scripture, therefore, would not let the nations of the world have an excuse for saying there are 2 powers, shtei reshuyot, but declares, I am the Lord your God. I was in Egypt. I was at the sea. I was at Sinai. I was in the past. I will be in the future. I am in this world, and I will be in the world to come. As it is said in quoting a verse from Deuteronomy, and this is a very interesting one. See then that I am he. And the verse continues, and there is no God with me. Ein Elohim imadi. No God with me. So this passage has the sound of what we were reading in the Passover Haggadah itself. It has this polemical sound, this kind of rhythm of making a point and driving it home over and over again. And what this text is addressing are these ideas that I said were floating around in all kinds of places in Judaism and outside Judaism, that there were more than one power up in heaven. And just to give you one other thing. So how does the Haggadah, or this Midrash rather, solve this problem? Because it looks like, well, God is looking this way, God is looking that way. And it also relates to this idea of a young God and an old God, So the solution that the Passover, that this Mechilta rather settles on is called multimodalism or modalism. The idea that God can kind of like look different in different modes. Doesn't mean they're 2 gods. The 2 powers idea is binitarianism, really 2 gods, as opposed to Trinitarianism, 3, which Christianity in some sense may subscribe to. So just to give you a little example of other texts where that fuel all these debates that go into the Talmud and to a lot of mystical literature that comes out in Babylonia in 700 up to 700, 800, that period. And the Haggadah is reacting to all of this body of literature. So you know the word Elohim in the Bible is in plural. So there are lots of arguments in the Talmud and in these other mystical and other sources about whether that means there's 2 gods. And some of the sages argue against this by saying, well, wherever there's Elohim, you'll always find Adonai in a passage close by. So that means that no, Elohim is really, it's really the emphasis is on one God, it's on Adonai. But don't think that there's 2. There's a passage in the book of Genesis about Enoch. The passage says, Enoch walked with God and was no more. So what does that mean? So nobody really knows. It seems like Enoch does not die. Enoch is taken up to heaven in some live way. And the question is, well, what happened to him? And eventually there are 3 books of Enoch that are written. None of them are in the Bible, for sure. And the last one has Enoch turning into Metatron. And Metatron is kind of a number 2 god. God's kind of favorite number 2. So you see a very rich and very long tradition about Enoch up there. And then there's a very mysterious passage in the book of Daniel, Daniel 7:9. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. So later, notice thrones in the plural. So later in that same passage, there's throne in singular, but we have thrones. That's already saying God is in one, who's in the other. And there's a well-known passage in the Talmud that has Rabbi Akiva expressing the idea that this is the throne of David, and David is enthroned right up there next to God. And David is, a heavenly figure that is right next to God and with all kinds of powers to act like God too. So these are just some examples of the kind of literature and the kind of thinking, the kind of theology that's out there that the Haggadah is reacting strongly against in a polemical way to say, no, it's God alone. No angels, no seraphs, no messengers. Don't be thinking that these are intermediaries. Don't be thinking that there could be another God. And putting down very forcefully this heresy within Judaism itself. Okay. And I just want to say, it's not just the general idea that there could be 2 powers or there could be intermediaries, because in Judaism, we find early sources that actually focus on Moses being perhaps one of these intermediary bodies, or maybe even a divine character. And I'll give you 2 quick examples of that. So in the Shema, we read this, the 2nd paragraph of the Shema. If then you obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you this day, loving the Lord your God and serving him with all your heart and soul, I will grant you rains for your land and season, the early and the late. Now, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of opportunity there for midrash, right? It seems very straightforward. We're all familiar with that. But we come across the following midrash from a collection that's also from around the year 200, but this one is on the book of Deuteronomy. And this midrash says, I will grant, as like I will grant you the rains. Now listen to this, I will grant, not by the hand of an angel, not by the hand of a messenger. So what could the midrash possibly be talking about? Where is there any room for thinking that, I will grant the rains has anything to do with any opening for thinking that it's got to do with angels or messengers? And the answer is actually right staring us in the face if we step back and remember one thing. Who is it who's talking here? Who's talking? It's Moses who's talking. If you obey the commandments that I enjoin upon you, that's Moses talking, upon you this day, loving the Lord your God and serving him with all your heart, all your soul. Now it says, I will grant you the rains. So the Midrash is saying, I will grant you the rains. There's people out there thinking that Noah, that Moses is going to be the one who is granting the rains. That now Moses is in this, either this quasi-divine kind of role, or it's Moses who is now turning on and off the rains and got this kind of very magical power. So the Midrash is only saying that because people are thinking that, or people could think that. And we've seen that it's certainly possible for people to have these ideas that there are intermediaries. And now the Midrash is telling us, yes, and there are people who are thinking that Moses is one of those intermediaries or those quasi-divine figures. Another Midrash, this one from Deuteronomy Rabbah, a much later medieval Midrash, but has early layers in it. So in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is referred to as Ish Ha-Elohim, and usually translated as Moshe Ish Ha-Elohim, Moses, the man of God. The Midrash says, don't read it that way. Read it this way. Moshe, Ish, Moses, the man, Ha-Elohim, the God. So saying, the Midrash concludes that the top part of Moses, the upper part of Moses was divine, the lower was human. So what we've seen here in the very short survey of a very vast body of literature are two things. Number one, that this monotheistic idea of no intermediaries has a long evolutionary period. The monotheism as we know it is the end. It didn't start with those ideas thousands of years ago. We went through periods of heresies arguing just against the possibility that there could be two powers, there could be all these intermediaries. And the Haggadah is reacting to all of that stuff. And so when it says, not by means of an angel, not by means of a messenger, not by means of a seraph, the Holy One, blessed be he, period. It's all in reaction to this stuff, the possible deification of Moses and the possible multiplication of gods in heaven. Okay, so what I would like to do now, I meant to actually ask you to be thinking about this, but let's take a minute. I've said a lot. There may be questions that, and I assume that this is maybe familiar, some of it to some of you, but some of you not. So let's take a question or two at this point, and then we're going to actually kind of switch the lens of our focus in the second part of the program to looking at things in the Passover Haggadah that actually support the human role in the redemptive process. So if there's a question or two for clarification, I'm open for anything of that sort. Maybe I was very clear, maybe not.
Yeah, there's not very many questions for clarification, but there's one if you want to address it or not, just about Rambam and Rambam not being against personifications of God, and if you had any thoughts on the evolution of that to him.
Well, he certainly had a very philosophical, very abstract notion of God, and understood that God was ultimately completely unknowable. But his Passover Haggadah included all of this stuff in it. So it's important to understand that. If we have time, however, we will see that he had a very, very different take on the importance of talking about Moses at the Passover Seder. So maybe this question will prompt us to look at one of the texts at the very end of this packet that speaks to that. So in that sense, it's a very good question. Anything else about clarification?
I think the other questions we can come back to.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So then let's go on. Let's go to can we have our text back up on the screen, please? And let's go to 6. Great, thank you. Perfect. Okay, so it turns out that the name of Moses appears once in the Passover Haggadah, which is kind of an interesting place where it appears. But even more interesting is a place where Moses is referred to somewhat before the actual his name is mentioned. And this is a very, very key passage in the Bible and in the Exodus story, and certainly in the Passover Haggadah. And it's passed over, so to say, I think, unfortunately. So the Lord took us out from Egypt by a mighty hand and by outstretched arm and with awesome power, by signs and portents. And by signs, this is the rod, as it is said, and take with you this rod in your hand, with which you shall perform the signs. Sometimes rod, staff, however it could be translated. This is from Exodus 4:17. And the key here is that these are God's last words to Moses at the burning bush. And you refers to Moses. God is saying, you take in your hand this staff, which with which you will perform the signs. And what's important to remember here is that God and Moses are having really kind of a debate. Moses is not wanting to accept this responsibility and accept this mission at all. What if they don't believe me, he says, but I don't speak very clearly. I speak with a thick tongue, etc. What if they don't believe me? So Moses is very resistant. And at this point, God says, in essence, stop with your resistance. And Moses puts out his hand and takes the staff. And in essence, Moses is accepting the mission at this point. Very, very critical. There's a midrash that tells us in every generation there is a Moses. And what I understand this to mean is that, well, there's more than one. There wasn't just one Moses in history, and the world is full of people who face challenges and face the possibility of accepting a mission or rejecting a mission. And I'd say all of us, in one way or another, and at one time or another, are in that Moses role, where we understand, we have a certain special gift, like this special staff, maybe. We have some special power, some special gift. We have some special job that is for us to do. And the question for us, just like Moses, is, can we summon the courage to say yes? And if we do, and when we do, the world gets redeemed a little bit. And if we don't, the world sort of continues in its sort of downward trajectory, I would say. So what this text is reminding us is that we're all in that role. We all face this challenge at one time in our lives or another. And what this text is telling us is overcome your doubts and your fears and your hesitations and pick up the task. The world needs you. Okay. The next, the place where Moses' name actually does appear, this is something that is lifted directly from the Mechilta of Rabbi Ishmael, that midrash that we looked at a number of times. And it's a multiplication of the plagues. As if 10 was not enough, the rabbis tell us that there were 50 at the Red Sea. One rabbi says 50, another says 240, another one says 300. It's pretty vengeful stuff, and it's been left out, unfortunately, from some, well, unfortunately in some ways, from some Haggadot. And when it's left out, this is the one place where the name of Moses is and where it gets left out too. Okay, so Israel saw the great hand which the Lord laid upon the Egyptians, and the people revered the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. If the Egyptians suffered 10 plagues by God's finger in Egypt, they suffered 50 plagues by God's hand by the sea. Again, right before Dayenu. So here we have the hand, we have Moses again. And what's interesting to me here is that both of these texts that relate to Moses relate to hands. We have the hand, take this staff in your hand. And then we have the hand of God. So think about this as, in order to do the work that we need to do in the world, the hand of God inspires us. But it's through our hands that inspiration actually comes and is brought to bear in the world. But I like this image of these two hands, the hand of God. This is very not Maimonides. The hand of Moses actually sort of grasping the hand of God, these two hands, and put them together, and you have some potential for redemption. I just want to show you, if we can scroll down for a minute. I want to show you what this, go down to the very bottom, please. Okay, where that arrow is, perfect. So this is a page from the Rylands Haggadah, a Passover Haggadah, an illustrated, illuminated manuscript of the Passover Haggadah from about 1350. And at the very, very bottom, you'll see Vayaminu Badonai Uv Moshe Avdo, Uv Moshe Avdo. That's the name of Moses as it appears in Passover Haggadot. And it's been looking like this in Passover Haggadot for at least 700 years, maybe more than that. But there certainly was a period before this was added to the Passover Haggadah. This is an addition that Saadia Gaon in 850, 900, around that period, said this is an acceptable addition to the Haggadah. He quotes it, which means that it was out there in circulation in Passover celebrations much before that. And since that time, this notion, this verse has been part of the Passover Haggadah. And there you can see it written out in full, and Moses' name in that beautiful script from the Rylands Passover Haggadah. Okay, let's move on. So much to learn from the presence of Moses. That's good. Even though Moses is reduced, minimized, where he is, much to learn from. Okay, Passover Haggadah has a lot about the notion of covenant. We don't have time to read these texts right now, but take it from me, the Haggadah is framed around this idea of covenantal promise and fulfillment. And the question is, what is it now that human beings have to do? We know God's supposed to take us out. God promises Abraham that the ancestors will be enslaved for 400 years, but they will be taken out. They will come out with great wealth. So what is it that the Israelites have to do? What's their part of the covenantal bargain? And if we can scroll down, that would be great. Could we go down to 9:1? Okay, first, perfect. So we find that the Haggadah tells us that Israel multiplied tremendously in Egypt. There they became a nation, means that Israel was distinct there. What does that mean? Milamed Shahayu Yisrael Mitsuyanim Sham. Mitsuyanim, there they became distinct. What does it mean? So we're going to look at our good midrashic source again, the Mechilta of Rabbi Ishmael, and we'll see that there's four things in which they remained distinct. They were above suspicion in regard to their sexual behavior. They married within the people. They didn't engage in talebearing. And these two things are really important. They did not change their names, and they did not change their language, the Mechilta says. You change your names, assimilation is about changing your name, and it's about, which many of our families did, and changing our language, which many of our families did, and intermarriage too. So the Israelites didn't do this stuff. And so they stayed a people. Lots of peoples went down to Egypt in times of famine, and they disappeared as a people. The Israelites did not. So they retained this distinctiveness. And that means there was a people for God to take out. Because if the people had completely assimilated and mixed in, there would not have been a people to take out. I want to just skip. Let's go to 9 for a minute, please. 9:3. We'll have just time for this in a very, very condensed way. Please read these two, 9:3 and 9:4 on your own. The idea here is that the Passover Haggadah in this midrash is telling us that there were two blood of two kinds that were shed by the Israelites in Egypt. I said to you, in your two bloods live. The midrash is based, this is a midrash also created or borrowed from the Mechilta, which is telling us that there were two sources of blood that the Israelites shed when they were in Egypt, right before leaving. One was the blood of circumcision, because in order to participate in the Paschal sacrifice, the males had to be circumcised. The other was the blood of the Paschal offering, had to slaughter the lamb or the goat in Egypt. Now, why is that so important? Because earlier, Moses talks to Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, "Oh, you can sacrifice make your sacrifice here in Egypt. You don't have to leave. Stay here. Worship your God here. Make your sacrifices here." Moses says, if we slay what is untouchable to the Egyptians, they will stone us. What that means is, if we slay your gods, these animals which you won't touch because they're so holy, you'll stone us. So God is saying now, in essence, in order for you to get out of here, you have to do this one thing that you were so afraid of doing. In some sense, this is saying, as you'll see in bold at the very bottom of 9:4, one cannot obtain rewards except for deeds. So these are two mitzvot that the Israelites have to perform before getting out of Egypt. And they require both of them shedding blood, animal, and the blood of the males for circumcision. This is taking a big risk. And it's sort of saying, like, I deserve, I'm meeting you halfway. I am doing something to satisfy some criteria that you have for me, so I will measure up and deserve to get out of here. Okay, let's move on, please. Okay, perfect. We're going to look at two more sources of support in the Passover Haggadah for the human role in the redemptive process. So Rabbi Akiva says in the Talmud that Israel was redeemed from Egypt only because of the righteousness of the women. And there's a story that Akiva tells about what happens. We saw that there's this separation of husbands from wives. We saw that in the earlier text that I read from the Haggadah. Pharaoh sees that somehow drowning all the males isn't enough. We're going to separate the men and their wives. And the men are put to work in the fields, the wives are at home. So Pharaoh's declaring death, the women are declaring life. And what happens? The women decide, we're going to go out there. We're going to dress up in our finery. We're going to bring some food out to our husbands. We are going to anoint them with oils. We're going to seduce them, and we're going to get pregnant. And so what happens is that they have their marital relations under an apple tree. And Rabbi Akiva brings an amazing proof text, a verse from Song of Songs. Under the apple tree I roused you. It was there your mother conceived you. There she bore you. So number one, people, the Jewish people would have gone out of business if there was no procreation. But we are told that somehow we are multiplying and multiplying no matter what happens. And Akiva is telling you it's because of the women who are declaring life, even though Pharaoh declares death. How is this actually in the Passover Seder? It is part of haroset. We all know that haroset is supposed to be thick and like mud-like, clay-like, to remind us of the mud and the bricks. But the Talmud tells us that's not all. It's also supposed to be tart in commemoration of the apple tree. And that's the apple tree under which all of these very exciting events took place. The life that our people continued as a result of what took place underneath those apple trees. So women, again, playing a very, very important role. If we can go down to 11, all the text connected with 11, this will be our last one. Perfect. Okay, so one of the most poetic texts in the Passover Haggadah, to my ear at least, is this one. Right before we're beginning the Psalms of Hallel, the first two Psalms of Hallel. God brought us forth from slavery to freedom, from sorrow to joy, from mourning to a festival, and from darkness to great light, and from bondage to freedom. Also has a beautiful ring and rhythm to it. And to me, it's even more beautiful if we understand that part of these words actually come from Megillat Esther, the story of Esther. The middle in bold, from sorrow to joy, from mourning to a festival, me'agon l'simcha me'eva u'me'eva l'yom tov. This is from Megillat Esther. Now, very strange that, and very interesting that the Passover Haggadah is bringing the story of Esther and Purim into the Haggadah. Now, I think it's doing this for two reasons. Number one, if you read carefully in the Passover, in the story of Purim, you will see that there's certain dates that are given. One of the dates is the 13th of Nisan. And if you calculate from that date, you will see that there's key events that take place right on Passover in the whole story of Purim. And go down, please, to text 11:3, and I'll read this to you. So Esther says to Mordecai, thanks a lot, perfect. Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days. These days, the Midrash says, these days were the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th of Nisan. Mordecai said to her, is not the 3rd day of the fast the day of Passover? She said to him, you are the elder in Israel. If there is no Israel, who is Passover for? Which means, if all the Jews are killed, what's the point of Passover? And Mordecai listened to her and did all she commanded. Now, what's so fascinating here is that not only is there the overlaying of these two holidays in terms of dates, but God is not mentioned in Megillat Esther. This is the one book in the Bible where for sure God is not mentioned. And that is what's brought right into the Passover Haggadah. So even as we're really celebrating God's redeeming hand, the compilers of the Haggadah are also reminding us in a very subtle and quiet way that, you know what, you just celebrated this other holiday. And in that other holiday, maybe it's a question of, like the Haggadah says, in every generation they rise up to destroy us, but the Holy One, blessed be He, saves us from their hand. Maybe this is another case of that, what happened in the Purim story, except that it isn't God who does it. It's Esther and Mordecai who do it. It's human beings who save the people. And one of my great teachers, Yitz Greenberg, taught that the Passover is the first holiday in the first month. And there we see a God who is kind of doing everything. And human beings, at least as depicted in the Passover Haggadah, are doing pretty little. Here we come to the last holiday. And by last holiday, we don't just mean the last holiday in the calendar year, which it is, but we go through this whole cycle of Jewish history. And that takes us to a place where we start in Passover, at least in the Passover Haggadah, unable to do so much for ourselves, God needing to do much, much more. We go through the year, we go through our evolution as a people, and we are able to redeem ourselves. So these are powerful words. They're quiet words, but you can be sure that if I'm aware of the connection between Passover and Megillat Esther, the Purim story, the sages were too. And they were, they could have made the same drash that I'm making now. I want to just say 2 more words in the way of summation, and then we'll open it up for questions, okay? So one thing to remember, Haggadah evolved over a long period of time. There was a set of needs, historical, theological needs that it was addressing, and it probably taught a message that was important for our people to keep close to their hearts, namely rebelling against really powerful countries for a small group of people is not always a constructive thing to do. It can be disastrous. Maybe don't do it. Maybe it's better to be a little bit more quiescent until you have a little bit more power. So, important lesson. I would say to you tonight that that's not necessarily the lesson that we need to take from this really central text of our people. We need to be able to look at this Passover Haggadah, and we need to find in it empowerment to take into our hands all of the skills and all of the talents and all of the resources and all of the creativity that we have so that we can solve the problems that are facing us and bring about the redemption that we need and that the world needs. So it's a creative approach to reading the Haggadah. I will give you that. But I will also tell you that the idea of approaching this text and this story in a creative way is not just by chance. The holiday is all about being free, and free people can be creative. To be a slave is about, needing to produce. It's needing to just make things, make more things. It's not about making new things, not about being creative, certainly not about being free in any way. So when we take this kind of free way of understanding the Passover Haggadah, a free way of reading it, a free way of interpreting it, we're really being images of God, because God is the ultimate free creator. And when we respond and react to our text in that way, that's what it means to act as an image of God when we face the text that we need to face, and when we need to draw from those texts and find in those texts the tools that we need to solve the problems that we face today in spades. Okay, so that's it for me at the moment. I'm very happy to take questions about things that I said, maybe things that I didn't say. And I really encourage you to look at, I think you all have these handouts. Look at on page 10, text 13. And here you'll see what Maimonides says about Moses. If somebody asks about that, maybe we'll look at it. But anyway, I'm all yours for questions, please.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Arnow, for sharing such fascinating insights from the Haggadah. I really appreciate you uplifting new narratives, creative narratives, as you said, that really our audience, I'm sure, brought it to life in new ways for them. And all of you out there, please go ahead and enter more questions. There's a number of questions here about Christianity and the sort of the how much of the Haggadah is a reaction to the growth of Christianity, or who's appropriating whose symbols. I don't know if you want to speak more to that relationship.
Sure. Yeah, it's not just a question of different theologies that are swirling around when the Haggadah is developing, but there really is a contest over symbols. And there are many scholars of the Passover Haggadah who are aware of the fact that in Christianity, Jesus is the lamb that is being sacrificed. It is the body of Jesus that is the bread that is connected with the holiday of Passover. And the notion of the bitter herbs is associated with the suffering, the passion of Jesus. It's certainly conceivable, and scholars argue, that when Rabban Gamliel says, you have to say three things, you have to give the definition of three things, Pesach, matzah, and bitter herbs, that what he's requiring us to do is to give the Jewish definition of these things, as opposed to other definitions that were out there. There are things that are like Christian Haggadot. Melito of Sardis in about 135 puts one together, and it's a kind of an interweaving of the Exodus story, but told in a Christological way, and in a very nasty way toward the Jews, in fact, as well. But there's thought that that kind of thinking and that kind of liturgy, which Christians were putting together, was an alternative type of Seder or Passover Haggadah, which featured Jesus as the lamb and as the sacrifice. So for sure, there are things like that. And our passage that we spent a lot of time with today, that's denying any intermediaries and giving God sort of this exclusive role up there in heaven, is certainly, can possibly be reacting not just to Jewish voices that are having these questions, but to Christian voices as well. And understand too that in the earliest times, the Christians were Jews. There were Jewish Christians. They were all Jewish Christians. It took a while for them to be Christians who did not descend from Jews. So it's very much an inside conversation at the beginning, for sure.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point there. It took several hundred years or more for Christianity to form as a separate religion. So, or at least as we know it today. So it definitely was a internal conversation.
Yeah.
On a different subject, somebody, it's not a very specific question, but somebody wanted to hear more about your comments on Freud and negation, if you have more to say on that.
Well, this is a paper where he actually he offered some very what some people think to be very clever clinical approaches. He suggested at some point saying to a patient, what's the most unlikely explanation that you can give for this? And he was sure that what the patient would say would be the true, explanation. But he felt that in the unconscious, the unconscious is saying yes to a lot of things, yes to everything. Yes, I want this. Yes, I want that. The unconscious is not saying no, I don't. And so when you see a lot of no, I don't, no, I don't, beware, Freud is saying. Not too much to say. It's a very short essay, but it's an interesting one. I could get it for you and put it, send it to you if any of your if the people in the audience are interested in reading Freud on negation. I'll be happy to make it available.
Yeah, we could definitely include it in our follow-up
sure.
email.
It's not long.
Yeah.
He was a great writer.
Yeah, sounds great. And for those of you, we're also going to include other links to follow-up resources, and tonight's study sheet will all be in a follow-up email.
Yeah.
As a sort of going back to the beginning of your talk, there's a question about what the practices would have been. The person uses the word Seder, but what would the practices would have been for people who didn't necessarily go to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices? Like what were the, if you want to say more about what the Passover holiday looked like prior to the Seder that we have today, or as it formed rabbinic tradition.
Right. Well, at different times in our history, there were multiple places where sacrifices could be made. This is something that under King Josiah, who was living or ruling, let's say, from 640 to I think 609 BCE, all of these other places where sacrifices could have been made in the land of Israel were destroyed. And the whole sacrificial system was centralized in Jerusalem. So there would have been times when it was possible to do the Passover sacrifice in other locations. After Deuteronomy, the sacrifice can only be made in the place where God will cause God's name to dwell, namely the temple in Jerusalem. And we know from descriptions of from Josephus, even if they are wildly exaggerated, there were a lot of people who were coming to do the Passover sacrifice in Jerusalem. I don't know if you couldn't actually come to Jerusalem and you couldn't make that sacrifice. I'm not really sure. I'm really not sure what would have been done, because I think they were pretty strict on this whole reform under Josiah of getting rid of sacrifice in other places. This was considered to be really headed down the road to idolatry and things that could not be completely controlled. There was scholars think that there was a temple in Alexandria, Egypt, and we do have old papyrus documents about a Passover as it was celebrated. It was celebrated in Alexandria, so it may have been that that was a temple that did enable people to have Passover without the temple. But it's a good question. I don't know. It's not like they had anything like what developed later. We just have no evidence. I can't say that there was nothing. All I can say is that there was no evidence. We don't have any evidence of there being a like a Seder-like a thing that took place in people's homes where the focus was on telling a story or eating special foods. We don't have any evidence of that until after the destruction of the temple. So we just don't know that there was such a thing that was going on in any way.
Thank you. Yeah, one comment.
I have one more thing to say about this, and that is that this too. So you might say to yourself, how can you have, Jewish people without a Passover Seder? So Passover was not the big holiday in ancient times that it became. The big holiday in ancient times was Sukkot, and that was called the Chag. Passover was not. Passover evolved into a sort of a more significant holiday because of the history that our people was subjected to. You know, destruction of the temple, people being in exile. It was like, oh my God, we're back. We're in exile again. We're in exile again. So the Passover story was elevated and became the central story that it was, because it became the archetype of liberation, of freedom, of redemption, of the hand of God acting to save us again. So part of the answer to that question might be, oh my God, if I didn't do the Passover sacrifice, it wasn't the same big deal as a holiday as Sukkot, for sure. So maybe that's part of the answer too. There were 3 festival holidays. I'm sure not all Israelites made all 3. And if you were going to miss one, maybe you could miss Passover, and you could do Shavuot, Bikurim, bring your first fruits if you're a farmer. You had more freedom of when you would do it, by the way, for that. And maybe you would go for Sukkot, and maybe sometime other year you would go for Passover. But it's a good question. I don't know if there's an answer.
Thank you. A question just popped up, which relates to what you're talking about here, asking, didn't we need the Greeks before the Seder idea? So wasn't sure if, we talked about the Christianity. I wasn't sure if you wanted to say anything about
Sure.
Greek traditions.
Right. Well, I don't know that we necessarily needed the Greeks in order to develop what turned into the Passover Seder, but there's no question that that the Seder, the form of the Seder, and many elements of it were influenced by the Greek symposium. The symposium was a kind of a ritualized meal. People would be reclining, they would be eating, having little hors d'oeuvres that they would dip, served on little trays and little tables. Those tables would be taken away, they would be refilled. There was lots of drinking. Symposium means to drink with. And there was a stylized form of question and answer that would go on at these Greek symposiums or symposia. So, and that's what we have at the Passover Seder now. We have a lot of those elements. We have the dipping, we have the wine, we have the questions, the sort of the prescribed questions in a way. So yeah, there's no question that the Seder developed certain, and we have the reclining, of course, developed with some of these elements in mind. There's no doubt of that. But it's important to understand also that the Seder is different in some important ways. And the notion of telling the story, I think, is something that was going to develop independent of whatever would be going on at Greek symposia. Because what's happening is, after the temple is destroyed, is that words, prayer, is taking the place of sacrifice. Study is taking the place of sacrifice. So all of this verbal stuff is taking the place of ritual sacrifice in the temple. And so the idea that we would tell a story and we would make a midrash on it, and we would teach Torah, and we would do all these kinds of things. Teaching Torah was understood to be, at a table, a substitute for carrying out a sacrifice. So we had plenty of reasons to develop a kind of a way of teaching and talking and telling that I think in some ways have roots, influenced to some degree by the Greek symposium, but independent as well. And we also, don't forget this, we do have 4 places in the Bible where it says, when in time your children will ask you, you shall tell them. So not to say that was happening in those early, pre-Passover Seder days, but there were things out there to build on, for sure. So that's how I would think about that.
Thank you. Were there other cultures that had like the dinner aspect story to some kind of tradition like Passover?
A telling story dimension to it? Well, in some way, yes, in some way. Passover is a holiday very complex. Its development is very, very complex. And when I talked about factors that shape this, I did not get to get into all of the factors that shaped the development of this holiday. But in the ancient Near East, the middle of that month of Nisan, called different things in different places, of course, but the middle of that month that is close to the full moon of this spring full moon, that was a time of celebration of New Year's for many ancient Near Eastern cultures. And some of what they would do is they would, first of all, they would clear out any type of leaven in many cases, because leaven and chametz is this kind of like sourdough stuff. And this is the time in the spring when grains are just starting to ripen. And there was great fear that the crop could be contaminated by this mold rot, symbolizing not that the mold is going to jump from your jar of sourdough and contaminate the whole field, but this idea that you want to be in a pure state so your harvest will be good and rich and not contaminated. You don't want to get rain at the wrong time, which will cause your crops to rot real fast. So it's a very vulnerable time for agricultural societies in the ancient Near East. And so clearing out any type of chametz, that this was part of what was done. There were rituals where the people would go from their cities and they would kind of go out into a desert environment, and they would purify themselves. They would get out of this dirty city place, and they would, get to a place of cleansing. And we read in the book of Exodus that how are you supposed to celebrate Passover? With your cloak on, your sandals on, and your staff in your hand. It's like you're headed out into the desert, into this place of cleansing, getting out of the places of impurity. And in the ancient Near Eastern cultures, they would also tell their creation stories around this time. So I don't know that they had a family rite that would look like what we're doing at our Passover Seders then or now. But the elements of kind of getting things very pure, going from a place of potential contamination to a place of, sort of space and clean, cleansing, all of that spiritually, physically, and then reciting your creation story. This is the creation story not of the world, but it's the creation story for the people of Israel in a certain sense. There we became a nation. So there are those kinds of parallels too.
Great, thank you. We have just a few minutes left, and so just as sort of a final question, there's a few people who asked about what we're redeeming today, and so I thought that as part of that question, maybe you could just give final thoughts on a message for our Passover Seders that maybe people can reflect upon as a final thought of reflection before next week.
Yeah. Well, right at the very beginning of the Haggadah, we read, "Now we are slaves. Next year we will be free." Okay, so that can mean different things to each of us. You can look at that in the spiritual sense, where Mitzrayim is the Meitzarim, these narrow places. It's not just a place of physical constraint, but it's a space of spiritual constraint as well. So you can think to yourself, where are you stuck? In what part of this Meitzarim, where are you stuck? And where do you want to be in a personal and in a spiritual sense? That's maybe a private discussion for you and yourself. But where you can ask, where are we as a community? Where are we as a society, as an American society, as a people on this planet? Where do we want to? What do we need to do in this next year to become more free? Maybe that means more free in the sense of strengthening the democratic institutions in this country, which certainly need a lot of strengthening at this point. And maybe a la Moses, who finally takes the task in the staff into his hand. Maybe there's a role that you can play. Maybe there's a role you want to play in terms of civic engagement and helping promote civic engagement. Maybe there are things that you want to contribute to that do that. Maybe you want to knock on doors, at whatever election you can to engage people to vote. All kinds of things like that. Maybe in terms of climate change, this is maybe the biggest of the big. And in some sense, hard to ignore, but in some sense also very easy to push off for either another generation or another time. Maybe there's something you want to sort of take your hand and grab onto between this Passover and next. Maybe you want to get involved in some way in dealing with climate change. And maybe you want to buy an electric car or a hybrid. There are things to do. There are things to do. And, really, Passover is a time to think about how we can push this world one little bit step closer to redemption. And when you see that passage in the Haggadah, if you have a traditional Haggadah, and you see this, take this staff in your hand, I hope you'll think about that passage in a different way and think about what it would mean for you to take it in your hand and me to take it in mine.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's a very important point for us to end on, and I appreciate all of the lessons that you shared with us this evening. And hopefully, I'm sure everybody here who's joining us will have much to share at their Passover Seder. So thank you again.
Well, thank you all very much for this opportunity. Thank you, Matt, and thanks others. And I don't see all you who are here, but I feel your presence, and I hope you feel mine. And Chag Sameach to everybody.